Peace, family. I'm back with another one. This is the Helping Our People Elevate YouTube channel where you can get those good podcasts. You get them good interviews, study classes, and more. You know, we got our five principles: love, truth, peace, freedom, justice, nationality, and birthrights, which are the most important two when you add the seven in there. As you see on the screen, our sponsors are the Morris Investigative Research Committee. Today's discussion is about the suffrage movement, women's rights, and the women's feminist movement, how it all took place, and how the government used these movements to destroy the so-called black family, the black structure, the black house homes, etc. They destroyed the black families. And so again, if you're new, hit that subscribe button. If you're a returner, as I always say, I appreciate you checking the content out. And so without holding y'all, we're going to jump straight into it. Peace and love, family.
On behalf of Akuno Senko for Bay, you know what I'm saying? Jay, where you at? We're trying to help our people elevate. Hope. H-O-P-E. We're giving them hope. We doing what we gotta do, you know. Every day, one step at a time, man. We gonna make it happen. Helping our people elevate. Yeah. Sometimes I practice focus, thought, and meditate. I'm trying to come with other ways to help our people elevate and seeking knowledge, make me levitate. The lifted mental state is what results from how we orchestrate. This for the family's sake. Let's self-reflect and self-evaluate. And every day, make sure the steps you take, you calculate. Receive a master's fate. I know I can't exist without the hate, but that's okay. I balance that with higher self today. Success is on this way, and after that, my flesh can pass away.
We're going to talk about the suffrage movement to the feminist movement, the cause and effects on the black community, how these movements affected the so-called black community, how they affected our people in today's generation. So like I said, how government assistance was used to destroy the black families, and how so many of our women are dependent on housing and food stamps and all these different programs, while at the same time, the so-called black male is mistreated due to how Europeans use these programs to divide the so-called black man and black woman. And so when we talk about the suffrage movement and the women's rights movement, these were two interrelated social and political movements aimed at securing equal rights and opportunities for women, especially in areas where they were historically excluded or marginalized. Women's suffrage leaders left out black women, whether it was running for office, as Chisholm did when she became the first black woman to be elected to Congress, or encouraging black voter registration at the height of the civil rights movement, as Hammer did. Black women suffragists have put themselves in the line of fire over and over again. Voting rights can't be divorced from civil rights, but unfortunately, the 1848 Seneca Fall Convention, the first U.S.-held women's rights conference organized by Lucretia Mott and Stanton, failed to address the racism and the first U.S.-held women's rights conference organized by Lucretia Mott and Stanton failed to address the racism and oppression faced by black women. By not addressing these issues, some white suffragists were able to present voting rights as an extension of white supremacy. Anthony Ann Stanton championed equality for black Americans, even signing an 1864 congressional petition that published for the passage of the 13th Amendment. But the ratification of the 15th Amendment on February 3rd, 1870, turned the tides because it secured voting rights for men of all races, but didn't extend that right to women. I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ask for the ballot for the Negro and not for the woman, Anthony's famous spewed. Anna Howard Shaw, president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, argued that you have put the ballot in the hands of black men, thus making them political superiors of white women. Never before in the history of the world have men made former slaves the political masters of their former mistresses. When the 15th Amendment passed, white suffrage began pushing harder for the voting rights for white women to the exclusion of blacks, Native Americans, and Asian women. The women's suffrage movement primarily focused on securing the right to vote for women. It emerged in the 19th century and gained momentum in the 20th century. The movement was driven by the belief that women should have a voice in the political system, particularly in the democracies where voting was seen to be a fundamental right. Key events: the first significant push for women's voting rights in the U.S. came with the Seneca Fall Convention of 1848, which issued the Declaration of Sentiments demanding equal rights for women. The suffrage movement continued into the early 20th century, culminating into the passage of the 19th Amendment of the United States Constitution in 1920, granting women rights to vote. The women weren't allowed to vote until the 1920s, and they tried to keep black women out of those votes. or from having access to that. And they felt that when the government allowed men of all races to be allowed to vote, it was a problem because they let so-called black men get this right before they even allowed so-called white women to have this right. And again, I say so-called because there's no such thing as black and white people. That is a social system that was created in the United States to keep people in a caste system, to make them subjugations through conquest and colonization. And I will say that many times. Key figures. Notable leaders in the suffrage movement included Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Sojourner Truth in the United States, as well as Emmeline Pankhurst in the United Kingdom. The women's rights movement was a broader in scope and addressed a wide range of social, political, and economic cultural inequities faced by women. It sought to challenge traditional gender roles, demand equal pay, improve access to education, address reproductive rights, and combat sexual discrimination and harassment. The first wave of feminism in the 19th and early 20th century largely focused on suffrage and legal inequities such as property rights. The second wave of feminism during the 60s and 80s addressed broader issues like workplace discrimination, reproductive rights, and family law. The third wave of feminism, 1990s to present, and the more recent fourth wave focused on intersectionality, how race, class, sexuality, and other factors intersect with gender and continue to fight against systematic sexism and misogynism. Activists such as Betty Friedman, author of The Feminist Mystique, and organizations like the National Organization for Women, which is known as NOW, played a central role in the second wave, while leaders like Gloria Steinem and Angela Davis also contributed significantly. In short, the suffrage movement aimed to secure women's voting rights, while the women's rights movement addressed broader societal and structural inequities, advocating for women's full and equal participation in all aspects of life. The relationship between the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement, particularly regarding the experience of Black women, is complex. During the 19th and 20th century, these movements both intersected and diverged, often resulting in the marginalization of Black women within both contexts. So I'm going to present a historical background going over the 19th century feminism and abolitionism. Early feminists such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were involved in the abolitionist movement, advocating for the end of slavery. However, after the Civil War and passage of the 15th Amendment, which granted Black men the right to vote but not women, tensions grew between the suffrage movement and the Black rights activists. Some early white feminists were frustrated that Black men received voting rights before white women, and this led to racial tension. Leaders like Stanton and Anthony argued that educated white women should have been prioritized over Black men, leading to a fracture between Black and white feminists. 20th century, civil rights and the second wave of feminism. Black women often faced exclusion from the mainstream women's suffrage movement, which was predominantly led by middle and upper class white women. Figures like Sojourner Truth and Ida B. Wells played pivotal roles in advocating for both women's rights and racial justice, but their contributions were often sidelined. Black women worked within their own communities to address the dual issues of racial and gender discrimination. They formed organizations like the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, in 1896, led by prominent figures such as Mary Church Terrell, to fight for both civil rights and women's suffrage. So we have to understand there is a reason for these movements. That our women have been put in the back burner for so long, we have to understand the cause and the effect, like I said earlier in the opening. And so we talk about the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. During the civil rights movement, Black women were active participants and leaders. Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Diane Nash, yet they were often sidelined within the movement's male-dominated leadership. The civil rights struggle primarily focused on racial justice, with issues of gender equality taking a secondary role. The leadership of Black men like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X tended to overshadow the contributions of Black women, who faced not only racism, but also sexism within the movement. So as you see on the screen, you see Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Diane Nash. These were sisters who led the feminist movement during the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s because they were put in the back burner. The fourth wave of feminism from the 1960s to the 1980s to present, the rise of the second wave of feminism during the 1960s and 70s led to renowned focus on women's rights, including workplace discrimination, reproductive rights, and sexual liberation. However, this movement was often criticized by Black women and other women of color for its focus on issues that predominantly affected middle-class white women. Black feminists such as Bell Hook, Audre Lorde, and Angela Davis argued that the women's movement did not address the unique experiences of Black women who faced intersecting oppressions of race, class, and gender. They helped create the framework of intersectionality, which highlighted how different forms of oppression overplayed. And so the suffrage movement, as they were starting to see that it didn't even help them, it was actually showing them how they were put in the back burner. And it's like I said, this was the system's way of dividing the male and the female. So they gave the so-called Black male voting rights, and the white women didn't get them. So-called white women didn't get them, and the sisters didn't have those rights. And so again, they put our women in the back burner. The development of Black feminism. Black women feeling alienated from both the civil rights movement, which prioritized racial issues, and the mainstream feminist movement, which prioritized gender issues, developed Black feminism. Organizations like the Combahee River Collective in 1974 explicitly addressed the ways in which both race and gender oppression affected Black women. Black feminists criticized the mainstream feminist movement for its exclusionary practices and the civil rights movement for its patriarchal tendencies. And so the civil rights movement was all about the males, and they put men in front. Like I said, Dr. King, Malcolm, Huey P. We hear about Fred Hampton and all the others, but they put the women in the backbone, so you don't know about Angela Davis, Bell Hook, Audre Lorde, Assata Shakur. I mean, various others. Kathy Cleaveridge. I mean, there were many, but we don't know about these women because they were put in the back burner. And so the sisters had to put their foot down. They stood up. More key figures in the movement. Sojourner Truth, famous for her speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" Truth advocated for both the abolition of slavery and women's rights. And so Sojourner Truth was an advocate for abolition of slavery and women's rights. Ida B. Wells, an anti-lynching activist who was campaigning for the women's suffrage, Wells often clashes with white suffragists who failed to address racial violence. And so Ida B. Wells, she would get into it with the so-called white suffrage women because they wouldn't speak up for the so-called Black women that were going through the racial violence or just the violence amongst our people, period. Fannie Lou Hamer, a leader in the civil rights movement who fought for voting rights, racial justice, and gender equality, often facing discrimination from both white feminists and Black male leaders. And so Fannie Lou had to deal with both, her own and the oppressor. The Combahee River Collective, a collective of Black feminists who coined the term identity politics and argued that liberation must address the interlocking systems of oppression affecting Black women. In conclusion, the separation of Black women and men within the broader struggle for civil rights and women's rights revealed a way in which the intersections of race, gender, and class complicate social movements. Black women often found themselves marginalized by both movements, which then led them to develop their own unique feminist ideologies and spaces for organizing. Their contributions ultimately helped to broaden the scope to both racial and gender justice struggles, particularly through the lens of intersectionality. During the women's rights movement and the broader civil rights era, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, government assistance programs like Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, were expanded to support poor families, which included many Black women. However, there were specific stipulations and social norms that disproportionately affected Black men. And so let's get into how, like I say, government assistance, how this was used to divide the so-called Black man and woman, to break up the families. They had what was called the man in the house rule, which is one of the most significant stipulations involving the so-called man in the house rule. This rule denied welfare to families if a man was found to be living in the home. Welfare inspectors would sometimes conduct unannounced home visits to check if an adult male was present. As a result, many families left compelled to hide the presence of fathers or male partners in order to continue receiving government assistance. So today, the woman can't get no assistance if the man's in the home. They've gotten a little less stricter on their rules in today's times, but in the beginning, like I said, they would come unannounced. If you had a man in your home, he would go to jail and you would be kicked out your home, you and your children immediately on the spot. So we talk about the marginalization of Black men. These welfare policies, combined with high unemployment rates among Black men due to the systematic racism and economic equality, contribute to the marginalization of Black men within the family structure. They were often viewed as unable to fulfill traditional breadwinning roles, exacerbating feelings of dispowerment. 3, the economic impact that it had. Black men during this period were disproportionately affected by job discrimination and exclusion from higher paying jobs. With limited economic opportunities, Many were unable to provide for their families, further perpetuating reliance on government aid for women and children. And so we got to remember this was a time when the jobs it wasn't for us. And so they were dividing the people. They were stripping us before the 60s and 70s. To go back early when we had the Black Wall Streets, the Allensworth towns. We had all these successful Black towns, north, south, east, west, all over the map before that. And so they had to destroy that, which was called the Great Depression. And after the Great Depression came these movements: the suffrage movement, women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, and here we are today. We talk about mass incarceration and legal challenges. The simultaneous rise of mass incarcerations disproportionately targeting Black men also removed many men from their family structures. This contributed to the weakening of economic and social stability in the Black community. So locking the brothers up, stripping them from a job, and then putting the crack cocaine in the community. What do you think they're gonna do? They gotta eat somehow. They have to feed their family somehow. So this is all social engineering. This is all conquest and colonization, as I've been saying in all other videos. These policies and social dynamics contributed to the long-lasting effects on the structure of Black families and the socioeconomic realities for Black men and women. Then you have what was the welfare laws. The welfare laws that imposed restrictions like the man in the house rule and other stipulations on government assistance programs, such as the aid to families with dependent children, were shaped by various political and societal forces over time. These policies were influenced by both state and federal lawmakers and spanned multiple presidencies. Key events and policies. And like I said, this was after the Great Depression. So the 1935 Social Security Act, the AFDC program, originally called Aid to Dependent Children, was created under the Social Security Act of 1935 during President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration. This act claimed to support poor families, especially widowed or single mothers, during the Great Depression. At this time, Black families were largely excluded due to local discriminatory practices in all administrations of aid, particularly in southern states. So like I said, after they destroyed all the Black communities, all the so-called Black towns, and all the wealth that so-called Blacks had during the early 1900s, late 1800s, the Great Depression, they came with government assistance programs to aid single mothers and families while locking the fathers up and keeping them from the jobs. Because before this time frame, we didn't need them. We had all the jobs, we had all the businesses, we knew how to grow our own resources, our own food. We didn't need them for anything. And I'll continue saying that in any video I do. 1960s Great Society programs. In the 1960s, President Lyndon B. Johnson expanded social safety net programs under his War on Poverty and Great Society initiatives. AFDC was expanded to include more families, but this period also saw the rise of the man in the house rule, which came about as part of the effort to restrict welfare benefits and keep costs down. The rule was implemented and enforced largely at a state level, but it was during Johnson's presidency that many of their restrictions were applied more stringently to African-American families in urban areas. So again, it was more applied to African-American families in urban areas and had many restrictions behind it. And on the left, what I'm showing y'all are some of the notes and that were written when these laws came into effect, or these policies came into effect. So you had a state level and local lawmakers. While federal legislation provided the framework for welfare programs, state governments were often responsible for administering these programs and could add their own stipulations. Many states and local governments in the 1950s and 60s enforced the man in the house rule, especially targeting Black families. Welfare officers were often racially biased, and inspectors had significant power in determining eligibility, often with instructive home inspectors. So again, they would come to your home and do inspections if you would apply for assistance, if you were a so-called Black woman. You couldn't have your man in the household if you wanted government assistance. This is why so many of our women now depend on government assistance, but the children's fathers are locked up, incarcerated. They can't find a good job. So they are here in the streets gangbanging, hustling to provide for their family. This is all social engineering, conquest, and colonization, subjugation. 4, the 1970s repeal of the man in the house rule. The man in the house rule was eventually challenged in court, and in 1970, the U.S. Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional in the case of King versus Smith. This decision helped to dismantle some of the most discriminatory aspects of welfare enforcement. At the time, Richard Nixon was president, and his administration sought to reform welfare, proposing a family assistance plan, which was never fully enacted. Wonder why it wasn't enacted. Why didn't it take effect? But in summary, Franklin Roosevelt laid the groundwork for the welfare programs in the 1930s. Lyndon Johnson expanded these programs in the 1960s, but oversaw the rise of discriminatory enforcement practices, while Richard Nixon saw the end of the Man in the House rule in the 1970s following Supreme Court interventions. But both state and federal lawmakers played roles in creating and enforcing these laws. And so if you did know, family, that this was how they separated us, leave a comment. If you didn't know, leave a comment. We got to stop being so dependent on this government, because they're really not helping us in any type of way. They're really doing more harm, more hurt than any type of help. With that being said, peace and love, family. I'll catch y'all on the next one.